to discuss 4 books, but really what the authors think, because we can read the books, we don't often get to sit down with the authors. And our first guest this evening is Stephen Harper, for nearly 10 years the Prime Minister of Canada, and rather remarkably, I'd say, because partisanship is quite lively in Canada, I think that even those who didn't vote for you would recognize that your 10 years were good years for Canada. And I think when I look back, I certainly feel that way, and I think most of our compatriots feel that way. But that's not what you wrote about, which is great, because too many politicians write about their glory days. You've written a very interesting book about the new world, a world that has been created in a sense since you stepped down as Prime Minister, and how to manage in this new world. And I wanted to ask you to tell us about that, why you came to write it, and what the essential thesis is.
Sure, thanks, David. I appreciate that. Appreciate that very kind introduction. Actually, the book kind of got its seed here at Raisina. It came out of a speech you heard me deliver 2 years ago. I talked about, and really then I was talking about the kinds of changes we were beginning to see in politics around the world that I thought were fundamentally driven by new social media technology. And that is to say that we were seeing increasingly new, unorthodox political movements or causes rise very rapidly, come into being, really, and new political leaders or new political parties coming outside of established channels of communication and outside of established institutions. This was a trend I saw happening. I like to say, you ask about, I'm amazed at how much the world has changed since I left office in 2015. You know, I say that in 2016, we had first the Brexit referendum, the successful Brexit referendum. Then we had the rise of Donald Trump in the primaries. I always separate that from his eventual victory in the election, because I think in a way the primary thing was more remarkable. You know, he ran for the Republican nomination against the Republican Party and won the nomination. We had those changes, and in every single Western democracy since 2016, there has been the rise to some degree of new, unorthodox, nationalist or radical political parties in every single one. Canada has, of course, we haven't had an election in 3 years, but Canada's been an exception in that we really haven't had this kind of wave. And so I thought back to, you know, why that is and how we avoided that. And basically what I've tried to do is assess, the book is really about the West. I could have written it more broadly. But why is this happening in Western countries? And I gave some of this diagnosis a couple of years ago. I said essentially what you hear more and more of now in the globalization, post-Cold War world. There are just very large segments of Western populations that have done very poorly. But what I really focus on in the book is what I think we should do about it. And I do unashamedly write it from a center-right perspective, because that's the approach I have to politics. And, you know, I say that these populist movements essentially tend to have a combination of 4 themes. Challenging conventional wisdom on market economics, on trade, on globalization, and on immigration. And I think some people will find my thesis a bit surprising, because I ran a government that was very pro-market, very pro-trade, very pro-globalization, and very pro-immigration. But my view is that in most of the countries, the arguments that the populists are making about these policies not working are largely correct. And so the answer, in my judgment, though, is not to jettison these frameworks. It's to do them intelligently. And I think in a lot of cases, these things have been pursued in ways that are just not very good. And the results have been poor. And I do point to things I think that we've done in Canada differently that made them be more successful. So that's the essence of it, and I won't talk for too long about the details. We'll get into whatever you want to talk about, David, and maybe the audience.
Great. Well, I think what we are seeing globally is some very strong personalities well beyond Europe as well as in Europe, but also increasingly bumping into each other. There was a sort of bump between the United States and Turkey today. There are bumps all the time now between these very assertive governments. And it may be that all of that's manageable, but it also could be quite risky. And I wanted to ask you whether this is something that has entered your calculus.
Yeah, look, it could be risky. Let me just comment on first of all, as you say, strong personalities, or as some would say, a lot of these movements, kind of dominated by a strongman culture. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. I think the reason so many of these movements are identified with strong personalities is unorthodox or new movements by their nature, whether it's in business or government or whatever, are run by entrepreneurial, dominating personality types. So I think that's just to be expected. I don't necessarily think it's inherent to their ideas. And David, look, here is a way the theme of my book. I'm not suggesting that I am unconcerned or that we should be unconcerned by some of the things that these new movements say or do or want to do. In many cases, I think they're wrong or their ideas are not clear. But my concern right now is quite different. My concern is that I think what's driving these movements are legitimate grievances. And my concern is that the establishment reaction in way too many places is a combination of dismissal, ridicule, and delegitimization. And that is not going to address the grievances. That is going to accelerate them and make them more problematic. So I think what smart people should be doing, look, you can denounce. I used to say to my party, I came to office by uniting a bunch of center-right parties. We were all divided. And I used to say to my party, in our kind of political base, if 1 or 2 or maybe 5% of the people are out forming new movements or dissatisfied, we can dismiss that as extremists. But when it becomes 10% or 20% or 40%, in a democratic society, you can't say they're all extremists. They're becoming mainstream, and you've got to, if you're concerned about it, you've got to find a way of bringing them into the mainstream, either by changing their ideas or by, quite frankly, changing some of yours. And so that's what I really aim to do in the book.
Great. Well, I think what we should do is turn to the audience. I mentioned, Samir, that this is a new format for Raisina, and the idea is a bit like speed dating. So we have about 15 minutes for every author. I'm sure the authors are relieved they get to retire if they want to, but I did want to go out to the room and see if there's somebody who would like to engage the Prime Minister on these ideas and his book. Is there anybody here who would like to intervene? Please. Suman's hand went up first.
Yeah, and say who you are.
Yeah, I'm Suman Berry. I'm an economist. I had most recently been the chief economist of Shell. More importantly, though, I have had family in Canada and have family in Toronto since the 1970s. And so I think I'd like both of you as Canadians to indicate whether there is some special Canadian source. I mean, is there some reason why the extremes are more contained in Canada? And I'm not sure in what area I'm looking for the answer, but just on your introduction, you would suggest that it's intelligent policies, but as the Japanese say, then that just raises the question, why does Canada have intelligent policies? Does it go back to the fact that you aren't a revolutionary society? So could you give us some insight into what has led to these outcomes?
Great, Suman. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll maybe let me focus on the issue of immigration, because where Canada is a real outlier, not just a large immigration recipient country, but there has been very little or almost no anti-immigration movement in Canada. In fact, there's been pro-immigration consensus across the spectrum for some time. I guess that my honest answer to you would be a combination of those two things. I do think there are some cultural factors. For example, Canada has never had one single dominant culture. We've always had two languages. You go far enough back, we had two religions, minimum, always. So I think that makes the whole concept of cultural diversity and change easier. But I actually think that's a small part of it. I think that it comes down to fundamental policy. If you look at what drives opposition to immigration in a lot of countries, it's that it is illegal or irregular in nature. And I tell you, if immigration in Canada were large scale, illegal, or irregular, it would be very unpopular. And so, you know, there are ways of doing this right and wrong. I think we've had a good immigration system, a legal immigration system. It's not been one without trouble. In fact, I like to say that I ran the largest per capita immigration program in the world when I was Prime Minister. And one of the ways we kept it popular is we did not deny there were problems. When there were problems and abuses, we made a point of fixing them. We didn't try and pretend that any objection to immigration was just some inherent bigoted agenda. That doesn't get you anywhere with people. So I think it's a combination. I think culturally, Canadians are, you know, moderate by nature. We spend a large part of the year just trying to survive the cold, so we don't have time to fight each other too much. But you know, I think it's more than just culture. I think, and you know, we've had our upheavals in the past.
I agree. That's my contribution. One more, perhaps, and then we'll go. Great. I'll bring you the microphone, please. And remember to introduce yourself.
Yes, of course. Well, firstly, David, good to see you back. Not as the High Commissioner of Canada anymore, but as the moderator. Prime Minister, if you were the sorry, who am I? Yeah, correct. I am a former diplomat, former ambassador, Pinak Chakravarti. Prime Minister, if you were a Prime Minister of a country where 20% of the population believed in extremism, how would you deal with that? In a sense that ideological and, you know, let's say religious-based extremism.
Well, look, it's a really good question, and I've, you know, in fairness, in Canada and most, and for that matter, most mature democratic countries don't have a problem like that. So it's hard for me to really kind of picture how you would try and deal with that problem. I would just say that Canada has inherited, in terms of our core political institutions, there are many influences. But the most important cultural influences in our political system were the British influences. And if you look at the evolution of British democracy over time, they generally came to the conclusion, they tried, you know, the British tried all kinds of things over hundreds of years that didn't work before they found things that did. And I think they generally found that trying to include people in the political process, even if they were strange, extreme, or separatist, is generally better if they're any kind of significant block of the population than trying to marginalize them. And so I guess, you know, always better to get people to work through the process and try to get them into nonviolent dialogue than leave them on the sides where inevitably extremists will engage in violence. But look, I haven't had to run a society like that, and I can't say that I would have all the answers.
Right. I should mention that Ambassador Chakravarti was the first Indian official I met in Delhi after you appointed me as High Commissioner here. So it's lovely to have him with us. Sir, it's been great having you here, but I think we need to let you go. And
you've got 3 more.
We have 3 more.
Oh, I'm sure I'll be very interesting.
We hope we produce lots of book sales for you tonight. You've made a really great case for this. I want to say that I don't miss being the Canadian High Commissioner here, because the great thing about India is you can go on coming back and back and back, and the Prime Minister knows that because he keeps coming back, right, which is terrific.
And we just, let me say, David, ending by, we appreciated your service to our country as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So.